We're not crazy, the system is. Tune in to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health, Wednesdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time, on Pacifica affiliate WXOJLP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio. Produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, streaming live, podcasting, and archived at madnessradio.net. Thanks for tuning in to Madness Radio. I'm your host, Will Hall. And today we're going to be interviewing Dr. Philip Thomas, who is a psychiatrist calling us from England. And he does a lot of work around the globalization of psychiatry and psychiatry as a form of neo-colonialism towards non-Western cultures. So we're going to be talking with Phil about that and about his book, Post-Psychiatry, Mental Health in a Postmodern World. But first, a few things about the Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, who are the co-producers of Madness Radio. Freedom Center is a local Northampton, Massachusetts support, advocacy, and activism group, and we are run by and for people who have different mental health labels like schizophrenia and bipolar. We have a lot of different classes and groups and services that we offer. We do protests and educational work. We do a lot of peer counseling and community support. So check out our website, which is freedom-center.org. And Madness Radio is also co-produced by the Icarus Project, which is an international network, mostly in the U.S. and mostly online, although there are a growing number of local groups around the country that are connected to the Icarus Project. And it's people who are looking for ways of understanding and connecting around extreme states, experiences that get labeled bipolar and schizophrenia beyond the medical model, beyond mainstream psychiatric understanding, seeing what people go through as dangerous gifts to be taken care of rather than suppressed or controlled or eliminated. So check out the Icarus Project website, which is theicarusproject.net. So it's my great pleasure to be introducing Dr. Phil Thomas. Phil is an old friend and has been a longtime ally and supporter of the survivor movement. So I'll just read Phil's bio here. Philip Thomas is Professor of Philosophy, Diversity, and Mental Health in the Institute for Philosophy, Diversity, and Mental Health at the Center for Ethnicity and Health in the University of Central Lancashire. He is also chair of Sharing Voices Bradford, a community development project working with Bradford's Black and minority ethnic communities. After working as a full-time consultant psychiatrist in the NHS for over 20 years, he left clinical practice in 2004 to focus on writing and academic work. His academic interests include philosophy, post-structuralism, and critical theory, and their application to psychiatry, especially social and cultural psychiatry, psychology, and medicine. He is also interested in narrative and the moral and ethical problems of representation in medicine and literature. Phil is particularly interested in the practical values of narrative in recovery from psychosis. He has developed alliances with survivors of psychiatry, service users, and community groups locally, nationally, and internationally, and is well known for the column he wrote with his colleague Pat Bracken in Open Mind magazine called Post-Psychiatry. He is a founding member and co-chair of the Critical Psychiatry Network in Britain and has published well over 100 scholarly papers. Free Association Books published his first book, Dialectics of Schizophrenia, in 1977. His second book, Voices of Reason, Voices of Insanity, written with Ivan Ludar and published by Brunner Routledge in April 2000, examined the different meanings attached to the experience of hearing voices over 2,500 years of Western culture. Oxford University Press recently published Phil's third book, Post-Psychiatry, co-authored with Pat Bracken in 2005. Phil, thanks a lot for joining us today on Madness Radio.
My pleasure.
So I'm really interested in talking with you about the general issues of globalization in psychiatry and what sort of the pharmaceutical industry and the medical model has in store for countries beyond North America and Europe.
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is this is really an enormous issue, and it may, rather than just going straight into the historical background to this, because there's been some really excellent erudite and scholarly examinations of this whole issue by various people. It might be helpful if I just talk for a moment about my own experience. A few years ago, I can't remember which year it was, I think it was 2003, I was fortunate enough to, or unfortunate enough, depending upon your point of view, to attend the World Psychiatric Association meeting in Yokohama in Japan. Fortunate because I'd never been to Japan before, and I was completely bowled over by the people and its culture. But unfortunate for my first experience of it to be this huge exhibition center in Yokohama, where the psychiatrists from all over the world were gathering. And there was a huge, before you could get to any of the sort of meeting venues in this enormous conference center, there was an enormous exhibition hall where the world's best and greatest pharmaceutical industries were parading their worlds. I mean, their wares. This may sound grandiose, but just imagine it for one moment, that amazing bit in the New Testament where Jesus goes into the temple and and sees all the tables of the usurers. I mean, that was the sort of image.
Wow.
I'm not being grandiose, and perhaps people think I am, but just for a moment, I wished I was wearing white robes and a pair of sandals rather than a suit. But that was the sort of, coming from a Christian sort of background, that was the sort of image that came into my mind about where this was all at. But these drug companies were not just present in terms of their physical embodied presence, but they were also there, had a very visible presence in terms of setting the academic and research agendas that many of the psychiatrists were then up to following. So that, for example, they'd been very actively involved in organizing a number of symposia. I can't remember the names of these things, but the sorts of things were depression and anxiety where East meets West, and probably completely inappropriately named things like culture and psychiatry looks at schizophrenia in South Asia or Southeast Asia, and in fact, when you looked at what was going on at these things, they were really nothing more than a neat way for the industry of promoting the idea that forms of distress and forms of alienation that in the West we would identify today in terms of depression or anxiety or even schizophrenia have to be so labeled and identified in non-Western cultures. And it seems to me that there's only one set of interests that's being served by that crude way of finessing our experiences, and that is the global interests of the pharmaceutical industry. Why do I say that? Quite simply because there is now a lot of evidence. If you look at the outcome studies of the World Health Organization's international pilot studies of schizophrenia that were conducted in the 1970s, and more recently the follow-on study that was, I think, undertaken in 12 different countries, and these were sort of very well designed scientific studies by doctors, epidemiologists, psychologists. They got all the world experts and authorities together to design the study, to implement it, and to interpret the results, to analyze the data and then interpret and write it all up. But if you looked at those studies that were specifically designed to compare the incidence and the prevalence and outcome of schizophrenia in, if we can use the expressions broadly, economically advantaged countries like Denmark, America, and Britain, with economically disadvantaged countries like Nigeria, Sri Lanka, and I think and India, that if you compare the outcome of schizophrenia in so-called advanced with so-called developing countries, the outcome of schizophrenia was actually better in the poorer countries. From that, a number of people now have concluded, well, actually, there's perhaps something that's quite harmful or damaging about biomedical interpretations of psychosis, especially when these are exported to countries where these concepts of schizophrenia are alien and don't feature at all.
Now, is it what are the possible different factors that play into this? Because I know one of the questions is sort of like cultural understandings of what schizophrenia is, and the idea of how do you have a stable, clear kind of object of discussion when we're talking about schizophrenia across cultures. And I guess another question factoring into that would be just the differences in terms of the way that communities are responding to people who are in these kind of states of distress, and they end up getting into hospital situations in the West, and then in other countries they never even really enter into the mental health system.
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely right, and I think those are two broad areas. There are probably 3 or 4 broad areas where you can say this is that may be helpful in understanding why it is a condition like schizophrenia appears to have a better outcome in economically disadvantaged countries than it does in economically advantaged countries. The first is that one has to ask is to step back from all this and say, well, what is the relevance of the concept of schizophrenia in non-Western cultures? The word is peculiarly, it's a Greek neologism. It's a word that was invented in 1911 by a Swiss psychiatrist, Eugen Bleuler, who brought together 2 Greek words to explain, to try and delineate this category of distress, schizophrenia, split mind or split psyche. And the first thing that one has to say is that, and I won't even attempt to go into the sort of philosophical arguments behind this, but there are serious problems about translating words that are rooted in the concepts and values and belief systems of one culture over into another culture. I mean, that's just one whole set of issues. There's another whole set of issues which is partially related to that, and that is the whole notion of Western notions of distress and madness that have been evolved into concepts like schizophrenia presuppose a whole set of assumptions about the nature of the self that is being spoken about the nature of the relationship between self and society and culture. And in the West, we have a peculiarly, when you compare, let's say, with South Asian or with African cultures, the notion of the self that is being spoken about here is quite different. In the West, we think of the individualized, interiorized self. We think of the self that's sort of somehow like the noble hero, cut off from other selves, that's cut off from society, that's cut off from community. The whole of Western psychology and psychiatry functions upon the assumption that the self can best be understood in terms of internal processes in the inner mind. This is what anthropologists tell us. Whereas in South Asian cultures or African cultures, there's a very different notion of the self that applies, a self that's defined much more closely in terms of ties and moral duties to society, to culture, to family, to faith tradition, and that isn't thought of in this sort of individualized, interiorized, this little box view of the mental world of the individual that we have in the West. So that those sorts of notions are really important to take into account when we look at what we call schizophrenia in Western cultures and compare it with the sorts of equivalent, if there are, levels of distress in non-Western cultures.
And then that,
thirdly,
and I was saying that comes back to what you were saying before about the fact that people end up doing better in those cultures when they have similar kinds of experiences.
Absolutely. Well, this ties into the point that you were making, I think, about the relationship between the individual and the society or culture in which the individual is found. It's impossible. We don't particularly consider that to be important in the West. If we do, it's only important insofar as we can measure it, measure things like stigma, we can measure things like social exclusion or isolation, but we don't actually look at what it means in real practical terms. And of course, what it means in real practical terms in non-Western cultures is that there are very different ways of thinking through in those cultures what's happening to a person who's having strange or unusual experiences. A really good example of this, I think, is given by a South African clinical psychologist who I heard lecture a few years ago. He's not only versed in clinical psychology, but he's also and I can't do the click, so forgive me, but he's also a member of the Xhosa people. And within Xhosa, the Xhosa tradition, hello?
Hey, Phil.
We dropped out.
Yeah, we just lost each other. Okay, so sorry about that. So
no problem.
Yeah.
Is this all right?
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. I'm afraid that I'm not. I'm sorry if I'm not quite helping frame things in a clear way, because I know that you were going to make a third point previously, and then I kind of interrupted you.
It was related to your framing of it was really helpful, because the third point is the role that culture has in shaping our experience.
Okay, so let's roll the tape again. You were talking about the Xhosa people, and let's just kind of pick it up where we got interrupted then.
Sure.
So just go ahead.
Well,
yeah.
in the Xhosa culture, but if somebody starts to hear voices, it's not a moment of shock, horror. Oh my God, let's get the psychiatrists in. Let's lock this person up because they might be dangerous. But it is actually, there is concern, but there's a very specific way in which it's handled, because that experience within that cultural tradition is seen as being evidence that the person has, within the shamanic tradition, very rare gifts. And so the person actually goes off and studies with a traditional healer, a shaman within the Xhosa cultural tradition, and then finds a place, is reaccommodated back into his or her community as a holy healer, as a shaman, as a traditional healer. And the point is that if you live in a society or culture where the tradition is that these experiences have some sort of meaning, have some sort of positive value, then it's not a problem, and it's a lot easier for you to be reintegrated back into the society as an esteemed and valued member who can make important contributions to the community that you're living in. And that's so different from with, let's say, most Western post-industrial societies, where we all know what schizophrenia equals. The experience of hearing voices equals something that's to be feared and dreaded.
Phil, what about other kind of mental health distress situations, like what gets called depression or what gets called anxiety?
Well, I think that exactly the same applies here. I'm doing some work at the moment with colleagues in the university here where I work, which is developing a very simple, philosophically grounded critique of the whole notion of translation. And depression is a really good example. You know, we have an assumption in the West, and this reflects what I was saying earlier about the sort of individualized, containerized view of the self. Let's just take two very simple sentences. If I say, sadness is in my heart, or I say the sentence, water is in my glass. Now, those two sentences are identical in terms of their structure. If you parse them, if you analyze them, you'd find they're exactly the same. But of course, we're engaging in very, very different types of what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein would say were language games when we use those two sentences. If I use the sentence, water is in my glass, I'm making a number of assumptions about the relationship between the sentence and the physical world, that there is water in a glass, that I can measure the water, I can measure its physical properties, I can measure the impurities in the water, I can measure its temperature, its specific gravity, its viscosity. I can do a whole load of, it opens up a whole range of possible sorts of things that I can do with the water in the glass. If I say sadness is in my heart, I'm making a serious mistake if I assume, or if anybody else assumes for that matter, that I'm indulging in the same sort of language games. I'm not. I'm using metaphor, that you can't literally see the sadness that's in my heart. You can't actually measure it. You can't actually take it out and put it under a microscope in the way that you could with water. But what psychiatry and psychology have been doing for the last 100 years or so, it's been doing exactly that. It's been deluding itself into believing that it can actually engage in the same sort of language game when somebody says sadness is in my heart. Oh, right, okay, tell us exactly how much. Could you point on this scale and say exactly where it is? And also, more than that, can you be a little bit more precise about precisely what sort of sadness are we talking about here? So, there is a real difference in terms of the types of language we use. Now, if you extend that argument across to different languages that we speak, for example, in the Gujarati language that's widely used in parts of northern India, there is no word for depression. People use completely different ways of expressing sadness. They say, my heart is sinking, or my body feels heavy. They don't talk about sadness being a property of an individual. It's expressed in a completely different way. So I think that there are real problems if we assume that, for example, if we're trying to translate across from English into one of these South Asian languages where there is no word for depression, I think it's a really dangerous assumption to make that we can somehow equate South Asian idioms of distress, like sinking hearts or whatever, heavy bodies, and say, oh, well, that's the same as depression, and that therefore means that it relates to the sort of concepts that we have in the West for depression. It does not. This is what Arthur Kleinman, the famous anthropologist, psychiatrist at Yale, described as a category fallacy. It's a serious mistake of logical thinking to assume that you can identify these expressions or these idioms of distress in one set of languages that somehow relate to our Western concepts of depression. When a Gujarati woman says in Gujarati, my heart is sinking, what does she mean? What does she expect? We use expressions like this not just to communicate to others, but with some sort of assumption about how other people are going to respond to us when we say them. She's not going to expect the people around her to say, gosh, that's sad, you must need some Prozac. Well, what she expects is something quite different from that. It may be, I don't know, it may be some sort of spiritual understanding of her experience. It may be some sort of starting point for her to explore her experiences with her family members in terms of what is happening within the family at that particular moment in time within family relationships. But I'm pretty sure that when people from those cultural traditions use those sorts of expressions, they're not necessarily wanting to have their bodies filled up with Prozac.
But so then this category mistake of trying to see this as an objective, measurable, individual experience. That's exactly what the World Psychiatric Association and the World Health Organization and the pharmaceutical companies are doing in trying to sort of spread this single standard model of psychiatric care worldwide. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what actually the goal is that these...
Absolutely. Well, I mean, to begin with, let's just go back to DSM-4 because if I remember correctly, when people were doing the background work for DSM-4 back in the 1980s,
Phil,
early
can you just, for
1990s.
people who maybe don't know, can you say what the DSM-4 is?
Sure, I'm sorry, of course. It stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the American Psychiatric Association's standardized way of agreeing the diagnostic criteria for depression, for the whole huge, vast array of distress that people experience and that psychiatrists identify as different types of mental disorders. So it's an enormously complex process they go through. It's quite literally diagnosis by committee. And of course, it's interesting, just as an aside, to reflect as to why that is. The reason for this is because there's no independent way of validating psychiatric diagnoses. Psychiatry is unlike the rest of general medicine or internal medicine. There are no blood tests, there are no X-ray tests that confirm the presence of these disorders. So the only way they can do it is by committee, to get people to agree what are the main sort of criteria in terms of reported experiences that people bring. But when they were going through this process 20-odd years ago, before the production of DSM-4, 15 years ago, they actually had a group of anthropologists, very eminent people from McGill University, people from other parts of the world, who were expert psychiatrists, who were duly trained as psychiatrists and anthropologists. I think Arthur Kleinman himself was involved. Lawrence Kermayer from McGill, I think, was involved. And these guys did some really excellent work on looking at the complexities looking exactly at some of the issues I've been referring to. And they produced a very thorough report about how cultural difference could be taken into account in relation to psychiatric diagnosis, but it was completely sidelined. It was marginalized, and indeed this was written about in an article, I think, in the Journal of Mental Science about 10, 15 years ago by these people, and sort of really pointing out how their report of the sort of problems that they'd raised about the whole project of psychiatric diagnosis in transcultural or in cultural terms, and how you could actually sort of try and start thinking your way around some of those problems is completely sidelined. Now, one's left really, of course, having to remember that when all this was going on, we were right at the beginning of the decade of the brain, the idea that clinical neuroscience could reveal the innermost workings of the brain and the human mind and throw open a detailed understanding of psychiatric diagnoses and validate those diagnoses across all cultures. And of course, that sort of very simple reductionist biomedical view of psychiatric diagnosis really serves primarily, I would suggest to you, one set of interests, and that is the pharmaceutical industry, because they're the people who have most to gain from discovering new so-called causes, conditions like depression and schizophrenia. So this is an agenda that has been, by and large, very, very subtly managed and controlled and supported by the world's leading pharmaceutical companies, because it's clearly in their interests to, just as it was in their interests in Yokohama in 2003 to convince all the psychiatrists who were at the WPA meeting from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, from economically disadvantaged countries, that this is the way they should be thinking about experiences like depression and anxiety. They should be thinking about them in clinical neuroscience, scientific terms that actually mean it's a lot easier for them to justify prescribing their drugs.
Phil, one of the things that I've noticed is that often in the U.S., in terms of a diagnosis or in terms of a framework, if a patient can get a PTSD or a trauma diagnosis, it tends to go a little bit better for them often, because trauma, the idea is with trauma is that it's really not a disease or an illness, but it's something that happened to you. It's like an injury, an emotional, psychological injury. And so, I think a lot of people who are very progressive and very critical of the mental health system and these disease medical labels have been, also very positive on the whole trauma framework and looking at trauma and PTSD. But I know that you have a different view of that, or a view of that in terms of the international context. So can you tell us about, looking at PTSD and how it's also part of this globalization move?
Sure. Well, I think your points are really interesting and right on the ball, because they take us to a number of really interesting issues. The first issue, which isn't so much a global concern, but it's more of I suppose, what your point does is to draw attention to the importance of values that are around different types of diagnoses. That that diagnoses are not facts in the way that tuberculosis of the right upper lobe of the lung is a fact. The psychiatric diagnoses are evaluatives, i.e., they're laden with all sorts of judgments and values. And the first thing that came to mind when you raised this fact was the sort of crude distinction that was around in 1960s anti-psychiatry, that people like, not so much Lang and his followers, but and his school, but certainly people who followed on in the wake of Lang made a very, and indeed perhaps to some extent Lang himself, made a very simplistic comparison. Zaz did too, I think, in some ways, comparison between, on the one hand, bad biomedical psychiatry that gave people diagnoses, and on the other hand, good psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic practices, which were seen as kinder, as being less harsh, as helping people to make sense of their experiences. I think, though, stepping back to consider the sort of more global implications of this, and this, I have to say, isn't so much my own work, but work that my friend and colleague Pat Bracken, he's I job share with Pat a post in the University of Central Lancashire. And Pat spent quite a lot of time in Africa in the 90s in Uganda, working with Save the Children, and he's developed a very powerful critique of the Western concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, using, I suppose, continental philosophy and the ideas and the philosophy of the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. I don't really understand a word of Heidegger, and I'm not going to go into that. But I think you can reduce Pat's argument to a very simple set of propositions, and that is that if you look at the way that the World Health Organization and what I would call global elites like the World Psychiatric Association are doing in places where there is conflict, is they're exporting the notion of post-traumatic stress disorder and the sorts of Western expertise that goes along with that, counselors, psychotherapists, cognitive behavioral psychology, psychiatrists. The emphasis in troubled areas of the world where there is great unrest and terrible things are happening is, let's get the guys in, let's get all these experts in to offer the disturbed populations preventative psychological therapies to help them process their trauma. And the point that Pat makes in his book, in a couple of his books, is that really, if you work in the field with people in these communities, the last thing they want is some expert coming along telling them how to process their trauma. What they want are their communities building up. They want their support their indigenous support networks through their communities building up. They need housing, they need clothing, they need shelter, they need food. Those are much greater priorities than the sort of assumptions that experts in the West have about what they need, which are based upon Western assumptions, again, about the notion of self, which I was referring to earlier. So really, in fact, I think, to be fair, I think that some of the aid organizations now are getting pretty savvy about this, and they're actually beginning, I think, to change some of their policies. I have to say, this isn't a particular area of expertise of mine that you need to speak to my colleague Pat, really, to get the definitive view of this. But I think
we did. I was able to interview Pat when I was in British Columbia, so we have a
right. You've got Pat. Well, I would defer to Pat's expertise, but I think that's the way the argument goes, and I think it's a very powerful argument, and it ties in very closely to the sort of work that Pat and I have been doing over the past 10 years which has been broadly called Post-Psychiatry.
Yeah, it's very, and
I have to give a plug for Post-Psychiatry.
Absolutely, it's a book that you and Pat wrote, and I want to talk about that in a little bit. But I think it's a general, maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but this is a general, it's a kind of a critique of the idea of more technology is good. That we have in the West, we have this idea that, okay, we have these technologies and everybody wants them, whether it's the automobile or pesticide-resistant seeds, or whether it's psychotherapy and pills and pharmaceuticals and diagnoses and psychiatry. And I think what's challenging and difficult is to imagine that poorer societies, countries that are outside of kind of the rich West, that actually it's not about catching up. It's not about, well, we want to have the same mental health system that the United States or Canada or Britain has, or we want our citizens to have the same levels of Ritalin and Prozac and Zyprexa consumption. And it's that, in fact, that there's a third way, and I'm just wondering is that an apt comparison? The sort of the idea that actually it's not about equalization access to mental health services, is about reconsidering what mental health is entirely.
I agree. I think that's exactly right, with a caveat, and the caveat that is that even before we get to the point, if you're talking about comparisons between the economically advantaged and the economically disadvantaged, that even before we get to any discussion about how one might see mental health shaping up from within a critical perspective, that there has to be, one has first of all to have resolved the gross economic disparities between the two.
That's what I think is the agenda here. Is there's an agenda to kind of separate these issues entirely, and on the ground, as you were saying, in an economically disadvantaged country, or even actually anywhere really, the separation of mental health and psychiatry concerns from things like housing and food and communities, it's a false separation.
I think that's right, and I think that one first of all has to take very seriously any attempts that are going to rectify the wicked disparities that exist between the very rich countries and the very poor. We live on this planet together, and I think you were hinting a minute ago in the way you were framing your question in a way that I would fully agree with. But there are very strong resonances between, I suppose, the sort of ideas that come out of what is broadly called post-psychiatry and other issues such as the green movement that question the whole notion that is so powerful in the West, and which comes, I think, probably from the European Enlightenment, this notion of progress. And that the only way we can make progress, the only way we can improve the world is through advances in science and technology. I would really question that. I think certainly people question it in the green movement and argue that instead of looking at improving and having SO2 scrubbers on power stations, well, that might be a temporary solution, but isn't the real solution about the way we live our lives and the way we use transport? And I would say there's a direct parallel there with mental health that says that the answer to distress isn't about bigger and better and more selective drugs aimed at these or those neurotransmitters. It's actually looking at the political influences that draw us in our lives into distress, that make us feel alienated, and that, this is where it can become quite revolutionary, and I think it really is. I think it's about questioning the whole sort of order that we've fallen under in the West in terms of our relationship to capitalism, our relationship to consumption, our relationship to consumerism, our relationship to money. I think all these things have very, very powerful influences in shaping our well-being or our lack of well-being. And I think that fundamentally we have to look at changing those rather than changing our individual responses to them.
Yeah, it's very exciting to me because there is this kind of green rethinking that's happening in so many different areas of the different kinds of technologies and economic models that we have, and it just hasn't quite caught up with mental health, and so I guess I'm wondering that would be a potential criticism, that talking about the ways in which traditional societies and traditional communities are able to care for people better. Sometimes, I mean, doesn't that risk romanticizing some of the traditional ways? Because I know that there often are very brutal and dehumanizing treatment that happens for people who are in mental distress, and if it's not about romanticizing and it's not about just completely going with the Western way, what would actually a positive way of helping and supporting and creating and promoting good community-based mental health, what would that actually look like?
I think, first of all, to say that, yes, you're absolutely right to point out that there is a danger here of romanticizing it. Don't forget that, the Salem witches who were burnt would probably be diagnosed as schizophrenic today, or MPD or something. But what I would argue instead, which is a point that Pat and I make in the book Post-Psychiatry, which was published a couple of years ago, is that yes, technology has brought certain advantages, but it's also brought great disadvantages. And in fact, if you look at the field of what's broadly called mental health, it's arguable that the greatest benefits have been brought in terms of progress have been brought not through science and technology, but through morals and ethics. And I'm referring specifically here to the sort of insights that were given to us by the Tukes, the Quakers in York at the end of the 18th century, who set up the retreat, and also Philippe Pinel in Paris, who released the chains of the mad in the Salpêtrière, and the whole idea that one shouldn't be setting the mad apart from the rest of society. That way lies dehumanization. That way lies ultimately the ultimate dehumanization, the Holocaust in the Second World War. That the greatest, and which was fueled by technology and racial science, let's not forget, as Robert J. Liston so ably demonstrates in his book, The Nazi Doctors. Let's remember that some of the most important advances we've made in terms of the way the mad have been treated in society have been realized through inclusiveness, through treating them as human beings, treating them with respect, not seeing them as somehow subhuman, which I'm afraid to say is how I see psychiatric labels. That's what psychiatric labels do to people. It turns them into non-human beings. In terms of the broader sort of global perspective on this, I think that there is a huge amount of evidence that some of the worst and the most heart-achingly appalling abuses of psychiatry are seen when poor countries try to mimic the type of Western systems of excellence. My colleague Chris Higginbotham here at the Institute for Philosophy, Diversity and Mental Health, we all gave us, this was a couple of weeks ago, we had to give our professorial lectures, Chris's lectures was the most powerful one. He hardly said anything. He just put a whole series of slides up of the appalling situations in which asylum inmates in some of the former East Soviet bloc countries are being kept in places like Romania and Bulgaria. You only have to visit an asylum in a poor country to realize this is the most appalling way to treat human beings. And this is the attempt to introduce Western notions of progress, Western notions of technology into poor countries. So I would really very, very strongly question the whole idea that by giving our notions of excellence of science and technology in the field of mental health in the form of psychiatry to the economically disadvantaged countries is going to improve the situation. I would very, very strongly argue that that's not going to be so. And so the question then arises, what is the answer? And I think the answer has to come from a completely different way of thinking about how we understand ourselves as human beings, not in a way that's encourages people to think from a top down, i.e. from the basis of my position as an expert, knowing psychiatry as I do, knowing what I know about psychology and psychiatry, but which turns that on its head and which engages and works with people in local communities, however, in whichever way you wish to define local communities, and I accept that there are many, many different ways of doing this, but actually opens up the opportunity for people in local at a grassroots level, working within villages, within local communities, to be able to say for themselves how they think these problems, first of all, should be interpreted and understood, and then, secondly, what sort of responses those understandings demand.
Phil, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask you, how hopeful are you for the future? Do you find these ideas getting some reception? I know you do a lot of traveling and you're connected internationally. Do you find that there are people around the world who are really starting to understand this and push in this direction? Because the forces of globalization and capitalism and pharmaceutical expansion are pretty huge and powerful. So what's your sense of the receptivity and what kind of hopefulness do you have?
I feel immensely hopeful about the future, because wherever I go, and you guys at the Freedom Center and the Icarus Project, places like that, there's some fantastic work taking place at the moment in the States which exemplifies this, which is about ordinary people coming together at whether they're communities of interest like survivors are, or whether they're specific communities in the village or faith communities, and are questioning the rights of powerful elites to determine the way they should think about themselves. And that, to me, is just immensely liberating and exciting. It's about the opening up of spaces and interstices where dissent and new ways of thinking about ourselves can emerge. Rufus May, who I think you've also interviewed, is doing the same. This isn't something that just applies to people from what in Britain we'd call black and minority ethnic communities, people of color, as you might say in the US, but it applies to everybody. And I just feel everywhere I go these days, I bump into people who are doing fantastic work in local communities through the processes of community development, which we haven't got time to go into, but which I'm a staunch advocate of. It just fills me with a great deal of hope that the whole monolithic structures of power that are enshrined in psychiatry and through the sort of professional elites, the World Health Organization, WPA, and so forth, that they're not being undermined. I wouldn't put it as powerfully as that, but I think they're being shaken from the roots, from their very foundations, by these voices now that are beginning to emerge. And that fills me with joy.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for joining us today, Phil Thomas.
My pleasure. Thank you, Will, and carry on all your fantastic work over there.
You've been listening to an interview with Dr. Philip Thomas, who is a critical psychiatrist based in England. He is the author with Pat Bracken of Post-Psychiatry, Mental Health in a Postmodern World. And you can get in touch with Phil through email, and the email address is pfthomas, P-F-T-H-O-M-A-S, pfthomas at uclan, U-C-L-A-N, .ac.uk. There's also a lot of stuff that Phil has written and a lot of information about him on the internet. Just Google Phil Thomas or Philip Thomas Psychiatry and you should be able to find it. That's about all the time we have this week. Thanks a lot for tuning in. You've been listening to Madness Radio, Voices and Visions from Outside Mental Health. Madness Radio is broadcast every Wednesday, 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Pacifica affiliate WXOJ-LP-FM 103.3 Valley Free Radio in Northampton, Massachusetts. For our live internet stream, podcasting, show archives, and more, visit madnessradio.net. Madness Radio is co-produced by Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. For more information, check out freedom-center.org and theicarusproject.net. For more mental health radio, listen to the News Hour from mindfreedom.org, Wednesdays, 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you have an idea for a story or guest on Madness Radio, or you just want to share what's in your head, contact us at radio@madnessradio.net.